What happens when glamour, fame, and calculated schemes collide under the blinding lights of celebrity life? Imagine a plan that seemed destined for profit, wrapped in charm, salesmanship, and Disick's unmistakable charisma, only to unravel in real time, leaving behind tension, embarrassment, and fractured trust. This is not just a story about art. It's a story about betrayal, spectacle, and the fragile dynamics of the Kardashian empire. Tonight, we uncover the dramatic unraveling of Disick's scheme to sell Khloé Kardashian's so-called art. A plan that looked glossy from the outside but fell apart spectacularly, one shaky deal at a time. The story begins in Calabasas, where Disick, long known as the family's notorious risk-taker, believed he had discovered an opportunity. He had often positioned himself as a man who could turn anything into a profit, whether through real estate flips or outrageous stunts. But this time, his eye landed on something deeply personal: Khloé Kardashian's attempts at painting and creative expression. What Khloé viewed as therapeutic, intimate sketches and splashes of color, Scott saw as a potential revenue stream. To him, it was the perfect storm. Art was fashionable. Celebrity-branded creativity often fetched astronomical prices, especially when tied to the Kardashian name. Why shouldn't Khloé's casual paintings be paraded as exclusive, one-of-a-kind pieces? Scott convinced himself that buyers would clamor for the chance to own a fragment of her private world. To him, it wasn't deception, it was marketing. But to Khloé, the act of putting brush to canvas wasn't about money nor fame. It was about release, a silent rebellion against the chaos of her life. The scheme took shape quietly. Scott contacted collectors, hinted at exclusivity, and teased connections with art brokers who were always hungry for novelty. Whispers spread quickly. Khloé Kardashian, the reality TV powerhouse, was stepping into the art world. Could her raw, unfiltered creations become the next Hollywood sensation? But behind closed doors there was resistance. Khloé herself never intended for her art to be commercialized. Her canvases weren't statements meant for galleries, they were personal keepsakes. When Scott pressed her, pitching ideas of gallery showcases and private sales, she hesitated. She wanted no part in a circus that turned her private creativity into spectacle. Yet Scott persisted. The more she pulled away, the more determined he became. In front of the cameras, Disick wore the confident grin of a man who believed he could sell ice to the Arctic. He spoke of Khloé's art as if it were the discovery of a new Picasso, describing her brushstrokes with a flourish of exaggeration that almost bordered on parody. "This is not just paint," he insisted. "This is Khloé's soul on canvas." The pitch was slick, rehearsed, and dazzling, but the cracks beneath the surface were widening. Potential buyers were drawn in by curiosity but quickly became skeptical. To seasoned art collectors, the pieces looked amateur, more like weekend dabblings than groundbreaking work. What Scott packaged as visionary appeared to critics as rushed and untrained. Behind whispers in private rooms, laughter began to replace intrigue. The supposed masterpiece of Kardashian art was becoming a punchline. The tension inside the family grew. Khloé felt betrayed. Her private expressions transformed into Scott's latest hustle. Sisters Kim and Kourtney raised eyebrows, questioning not only the art's value but Scott's relentless push to commercialize something so personal. For Khloé, it wasn't just about the art, it was about respect. She had always been cast as the strong, sarcastic sister, the one who hid her vulnerabilities beneath humor. But here, her vulnerability was being auctioned off by someone she once trusted. The collapse came in dramatic fashion. Scott organized a private showing, convinced this was his moment to shine. Wealthy guests entered a rented gallery space, sipping champagne as Scott boasted about the authenticity of Khloé's artistry. The canvases hung under soft spotlights, framed as though they belonged in the Louvre. But as the room filled, the whispers grew louder. Guests glanced at one another, smirks forming. Offers were scarce. What Scott envisioned as a bidding war fizzled into awkward silence. Then came the breaking point. A collector openly questioned whether Khloé even approved of this event. Another laughed, remarking that the work looked like something a child might create on a Saturday afternoon. Cameras caught the moment, Scott's face stiffening, his charm collapsing under the weight of ridicule. The grand scheme was exposed as fragile theater. Khloé, watching from the sidelines, felt the sting of betrayal but also a strange liberation. For once, she didn't have to defend herself or her choices. The farce of Scott's scheme had done that for her. She confronted him afterward, her voice sharp but steady, making clear that her creativity was not his currency. This wasn't about money, it was about dignity. Scott, caught between bravado and guilt, tried to spin the fallout as a misunderstanding, a noble attempt to celebrate Khloé's hidden talent. But the truth was undeniable. The scheme to sell Khloé's art had fallen apart spectacularly, leaving him exposed as reckless, opportunistic, and out of touch with the very family that kept him close. The aftermath rippled through the Kardashian household. Conversations around trust, respect, and boundaries resurfaced. Khloé reclaimed her art, insisting it remain private, far from the flashbulbs and dollar signs Scott had attached to it. Her sisters stood behind her, their loyalty unwavering in the storm's wake. For Scott Disick, the collapse was another chapter in a long history of miscalculations. His charm, often enough to smooth over scandal, couldn't mask the failure this time. In the court of public opinion, the scheme became symbolic of a larger truth. The fine line between entrepreneurship and exploitation, between spectacle and sincerity. And so, the story of Scott Disick's scheme to sell Khloé's art is remembered not as a triumph of celebrity branding, but as a cautionary tale. In the world of the Kardashians, where every move is scrutinized, every scheme magnified, trust is fragile, and authenticity, no matter how flawed, holds more power than even the slickest pitch. In the end, it wasn't just a failed sale. It was a revelation, a reminder that even in a family built on spectacle, there are boundaries not meant to be crossed. And Scott Disick, for all his bravado, had crossed them, only to watch his scheme collapse into silence.